Hi, welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. There's an episode of QI where Stephen Fry asked the panelists how many senses we have. And knowing that the obvious answer is always wrong, Alan Davis still gives the straight line 5. Right? So although sight, sound, taste, hearing, and touch get all the love, they're only our external senses. You also have senses that relate to your body, internal senses, one of which is called interoception. And interoception is an important sense for a lot of reasons. For one, it helps us be in touch with our emotions. It helps us regulate ourselves. And it also plays a role in making risky decisions. So to discuss this with me today and talk about the science behind our gut feelings is Sarah Garfinkel, professor of clinical and affective neuroscience. Welcome to Changing Minds, Sarah.
Thank you, Joe. It's nice to be here.
I'm delighted. So before we get started, I just want to invite our audience to share any questions that you have for Sarah in the Q&A board as we go. And in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, we'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. Okay, so Sarah, I get that, hunger and tiredness and things like that are things that you can sense in your body, but are gut feelings real, or are they just sort of a convenient excuse to do what you wanted to do before you got going?
So I'm interested in the biological basis of instinctive decision-making. And when we're bombarded with different information, which can be hard to cognitively navigate, your body can have an instinctive emotional reaction or physiological reaction, which is informative and potentially founded on knowledge that your mind does not yet realize. So your heart can respond before information is potentially consciously accessible. Thus, access to those internal bodily signals can help guide informative decisions.
So that's what interoception is this sense of what your body's responding, even perhaps before you're consciously aware of any information in your mind.
Interoception is a sensing of those internal bodily changes. So our body is awesome, like it's changing all the time in sensitive and reactive ways. Our heart does not beat regularly. It has subjective and embedded within it these beautiful patterns of acceleration and deacceleration. And these happen to all different situations. It happens during anticipation, it happens during decision making, it happens during emotion. And so sensing these internal bodily sensations is what interoception is. And using those can then inform your decisions and your emotions.
So how would you get a hold of that? I mean, it seems a very introspective kind of thing, but you obviously study it. How do you go about that?
So it is a challenge to study in the lab. Historically, people are focused on the heart because the heart is a discrete signal and it's easily measurable. The heart is also a very sensitive organ. So there's also a good basis for studying it in the sense that it is subject to these sort of patterns of acceleration and deacceleration, which are informative. But it's not so easy to do in a way which translates to the outside world, and the tasks themselves are under intense scrutiny at the moment. But historically, people have just used very simple methods, such as getting people to count their heartbeat in a specified time frame, playing tones in sync or out of sync with their heart, and getting people to judge the synchronicity of those tones. These different measures have shown to have some face validity. They do map onto decision-making capabilities. But there are also other tasks that people also use, and other tasks are in development. Some people look at sensitivity to gastric signals by getting people to drink water and looking at sensitivity to fullness. Other people have used respiration type studies, which I've used as well, where you hide respiratory filters on people's airwaves and see people's sensitivity to detect the presence of those filters. And it's an exciting field to try and develop these different measures of interoception in the lab as a means to create comprehensive profiles of people.
And I read that Tony Damasio did some work that he, what he called somatic markers, right? Which he started to link these feelings of heart rate and others to decision-making using tasks in a lab. Can you give us a feel for how those things even link up?
Yeah, so he looked at things like the Iowa gambling task and in relation to different bodily signals. And this has really inspired a lot of future work. I think I'll give you an example of Tim Dalglish's work, which was sort of inspired by Damasio's earlier work, but I think has taken it to a whole new level. So he's looked at intuitive decision-making using this intuitive decision-making task, where there's different cards associated with good outcomes or bad outcomes. And there's a complex algorithm underlying which cards predict good outcomes and which ones don't. And so if I were to say to you which are good cards and which are bad cards, you wouldn't be able to say, you wouldn't be able to articulate that. But over time, you start to pick more good cards than bad cards, and your behavior starts to do that. But you still have no conscious insight into this. But if I were to measure your cardiac responses, then you have different cardiac responses to cards associated with good outcomes relative to poor outcomes. So your body is able to differentiate good outcomes, poor outcomes before your mind is able to know that consciously, and that's able to guide behavior. And then the really elegant extra addition he did was he assessed people's interoceptive accuracy. So he used these very simple cardiac detection tests to see who was good at interoceptive accuracy and poor. And he was able to show that those individuals with the best instinctive decision making had two things. One, they had good body differentiation to cards with good outcomes versus poor outcomes. And second, they had high interoceptive accuracy, that is a good ability to accurately detect their heart. And they were the ones that performed best objectively at this test.
So that's really remarkable. I mean, that is a demonstration that your body is aware of this, that you're not, able to articulate. And then also that if you're good at hearing those gut feelings, you're the person who's going to do better on that kind of a task. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And you can be accurate at these cardiac tasks or accurate at interception without knowing you're accurate at it. So this is one of the things I think is amazing about interception and how it differs from extraception. So typically extraception is coupled to conscious access. I mean, it might not be if a stimulus is right on the threshold of whether it's perceptible or not, but typically, if you've heard something, if you felt something, if you've seen something. So there's typically a nice correspondence. Whereas interoception, our brains are processing what's happening in our bodies all the time. And we don't necessarily want conscious access to that and have that interfere with our conscious processing, but we do want to be guided by those signals. So my work also shows that you can be very accurate at these interception tests, but if we look at your metacognitive insight, you don't necessarily know you're accurate or know you're not accurate, but you are accurate. So you have this lovely uncoupling of metacognitive insight and interception.
Well, and in fact, that's exactly what I wanted to get to with some of your work, because you've taken this outside the lab and looked at decision-making, risky decision-making in a real-world environment, right? Can you tell us a little bit about your London traders study?
So this is my first sort of, trying to apply to the real world study. So I, a number of years ago now, had access to the London Stock Exchange and the trading floor. And traders will often say that they go on gut instinct, that their trades are made instinctively. So it was a way to try and look at this work that's been done in the lab to look at instinctive decision making to see whether this could be true for high frequency traders who make these very fast decisions for incoming information. And I was able to show that if you measure the interceptive accuracy of these traders, then their ability to accurately detect when their heart was beating correlated with measures of their trading performance.
What kind of measures?
Their profit and loss statements. So it was an objective measure of how much they made in a given year, corresponded to their interceptive accuracy. I should also add that all of these trainers had very poor metacognitive interceptive insight. So what seemed to be a good combination with them was the lack of insight. They didn't know they were being guided by their heart. They potentially had an external attribution, good trade, bad trade, rather than realize it was a cardiac effect. So the profile seemed to be good interceptive accuracy, poor interceptive insight in these traders.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm just thinking that, given that you're doing this on the trading floor, it's got to have been hard to measure things like their heart rate objectively. Did you just use things like Apple Watch or, Fitbits, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we use a pulse oximeter, a medical grade one, which was a soft sensor, so there's to limit extraceptive feedback, and this can just be done in a very portable way. You can also do them attached to the ear. So we use that, and we don't tend to use Apple Watches or other things. Getting the signals off, and often they'll interpolate over time. Like they give you averages, and what we're interested in is the ability to detect the individual beats. So we would use ECG is gold standard, and that's what we'd like to use. But on the trading floor, it was a medical grade pulse oximeter.
And ECG is electrocardiogram. This is what you would find in a hospital when you wire somebody up, or in TV shows.
That's exactly right. So if you were to come to my lab, I would hook you up. It looks a bit like a hospital in the corner. That's where we have our heart monitoring equipment.
Fantastic. So we've been talking specifically about heart rate, but I'm sensitive that within the business community, one of the things that you hear a lot in terms of body measurements is actually something called the galvanic skin response, or sometimes it's just abbreviated to GSR. Do you ever use galvanic skin response in your work?
So I've used it historically. It was actually working initially with patients for post-traumatic stress disorder and looking at body responses. And I was using skin conductance in that group that made me interested about the role of the body and how it could be guiding our thoughts and our memories. But my experience of using this measure and other people's as well is it's a tricky measure. And I blame galvanic skin response for why psychophysiology is not more popular, because I feel like that's like the gateway thing that people use initially for psychophysiology, and then they're like, this is useless. Like, the signal's so bad. In 30% you can get non-responders, so they're not showing a galvanic skin response, even though there may be other informative bodily signals. So you potentially get a lot of noise or absence of signal in a whole section of your population. And it's not a very sensitive measure. It's subject to random effects. It's crude. Whereas if you measure something like the heart, or even better, beat-to-beat blood pressure, these are very, very sensitive moment by moment changes that you can really see rise and fall. And they're much more sensitive for looking at physiological markers of emotion and cognition. And I think it's a great shame that they're not adopted more by the scientific community.
Did you say like a third of all people don't
Yeah,
respond?
approximately. Yeah, I mean, it varies, but some of them aren't people. We call them non-responders, meaning that they mostly don't respond. So it's not that they never respond, but in a study, they wouldn't necessarily have good enough responses to meet some sort of threshold, meaningful threshold of criterion to then put them through. But yeah, if you're using a nice stringent threshold of body differentiation, it can easily be a third that don't meet that.
Wow, that's incredible. Whereas heart rate, you would consistently get it across your participants.
Yeah, you could use everyone. Yes, and their heart, yes, you can use it for everyone. And then if you get differences in heart rate variability or other cardiac measures, they're often also meaningful based on the person. So for example, schizophrenia is associated with a very regular beating heart. So you don't necessarily get these interesting heart rate variability measures in them in the same way, but that in itself is informative about the condition in question. So even differences at the individual level potentially map onto interesting symptoms in a way where skin conductance is much cruder in its ability to map onto things.
And if I remember correctly, weren't the old polygraphs, the lie detector tests, based on galvanic skin response? Is that right?
Yeah, so that was my understanding as well. And then I looked it up, and I saw that more recent versions also now include respiration and cardiac signals. And this potentially speaks to galvanic skin response not being a very informative measure on its own, also subject to a number of individual differences and problems. That being said, polygraph, like their lie detector tests are problematic because there's no physiological signal of deception. So even galvanic skin response is a bad measure, but just what they're picking up is potentially anxiety. There's also really good evidence to suggest that the degree to which it has any predictive validity is based on a placebo effect. So if people believe that they're going to reveal something, then they typically or may show the effect because their body is then worried about it. And so it's also a measure of how much people believe in the test. But it's also not good for someone who, because it is potentially an anxiety response or an emotional response to lying. Those individuals high on psychopathy, who don't care, who are potentially subject to very low physiological responding, also won't necessarily show up. And they're the people that potentially you need to be most worried about.
Well, that would explain why it's not usable in courts, for instance, in the US or in the UK. And if 30% of the people, or at least 30% of your data are really questionable, you can imagine that you don't want legal decisions based on that. That sounds really terrifying.
No,
yeah,
absolutely.
The other thing that I was thinking is that, during lockdown and things, I kind of feel like I've personally been more sensitive to my body, and I suspect I'm just worried that I'm being ill all the time, right? So there's probably that anxiety right there. Do you see changes in interoception in the last 10, 12 weeks or however long we've been locked up?
I know, I've been thinking about this so much as we all sort of recede from the outside world to some extent. Then the external input fades and you're left more with the internal world. I know that there are some people looking into this. So Mika Allen, also Jenny Murphy, I know are doing various questionnaires to look at interoception, which I think is brilliant. I think we really need data on it. So I can only reflect on what I've noticed so far. I'm glad people are doing actual studies, but I've noticed personally that my eating habits have changed a little, and there's a whole field of work that looks at intuitive eating and ability to be guided by internal bodily signals. And I wonder, this is me purely speculating, but while we're just left with our bodies more, then potentially we're tapping into those signals to guide what we want to eat. But also eating can be driven by stress and emotional eating. And there's also research to show that people with good interoception have two things. One, they're good at intuitive eating when they're hungry, being guided by their body, but they're also more susceptible to emotional eating. Maybe because they feel emotions more intensely, and that's maybe happening as well. So I feel like my diet is also more chocolate, so that's also potentially being influenced by that. And I think health anxiety is a really big thing, because we're probably monitoring our bodies a lot more at the moment because we're all so worried about it. This is where it's potentially not healthy. That if you look at anxiety and health anxiety and anxiety in general, it's associated with a bias towards the body. And actually, it's more healthy to have a bias to the outside world, or have a flexible capacity to be externally focused when necessary and internally focused when necessary. Too much focus on the body is not necessarily a healthy thing. And also because, as I said, interoceptive accuracy and interoceptive insight aren't necessarily coupled together, then sort of overly monitoring bodily responses and worrying about them may potentially not be as accurate as it might be for extraceptive detection. So we're also susceptible to notice things that may or may not be happening.
Amazing. Yeah, fascinating stuff. So Sarah, if it's okay with you, I'd love to turn to some audience questions. Is that all right?
Yes, of course.
So I would encourage the audience to put questions into the board here. There are a couple here already, and one of them was just following up on this point that you made about the link between feeling emotions more if you're, more sensitive to the two different types of eating. What is the link between emotion and interoception?
Oh, so what is the link between emotion and interoception? So those individuals with heightened emotion are also those individuals who have a better capacity to detect bodily sensations. So there have been studies where they've got people to watch films designed to elicit sadness, amusement, anger. And those individuals, and then they classified individuals through those who are good at interception, those who are bad. And those with good interception reported the films to be more intense. And this is very much a link to sort of the William Jamesian idea that the emotional feeling states are guided by the sensing of internal bodily sensations. So a better ability to do that, you'll feel emotions more intensely. Was that the question?
Yeah, although raises a really interesting point, because that's kind of counterintuitive. I would have thought I felt the emotion and then my body responded. But what you just said, I think the opposite. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would switch it, and I'd say that the feeling states themselves are a product of the sensing of internal bodily sensations. So what is emotion and how is it different from cognition? Emotion is the sensing of these changes, and that's what gives color, the emotional color, to our experiences.
Amazing. Okay, so let me just switch to some of the other questions here. Many thanks for the talk, so impressive. I was wondering if it's possible to apply interoceptive awareness to help people who are shy or closed off. I mean, can the rhythm of the heart be used to better understand their emotions and deal with them?
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of work with people who are too anxious. I think shy is so interesting. So I'm not sure about the shyness, but I think that's a lovely question. Certainly, we've been doing interceptive training with people who are anxious, and I guess that can make people seem shy because they may be a little bit more scared to interact with the world. And we've been training individuals and also autistic individuals to be more accurate at detecting internal body sensations. The idea being, if they have earlier access into these signals, they're also better able to regulate them. And we have found a drop in anxiety with better interoceptive accuracy. And hopefully people understanding that they can have some degree of regulation and control over their body, and it's not just something that occurs, is also helping them to navigate the world a little more.
Can you train people to become more aware? So to help, somebody who maybe benefit from it more, can they learn it?
Yeah, so we've now shown that we can make people more accurate, and those studies should be published soon. We've got one under review and one is being written up now, and we're training people over time, but sort of not that many training sessions are needed at all. We gave 8 initially, and then we dropped to 6, and probably only 4, and you're already seeing really nice changes. Getting people to do mild exercise so the heart becomes more perceptible, giving extraceptive feedback, interoceptive feedback about whether people are accurate or not accurate. And then we find just over time, we don't even need to raise the heart rate. People are able to access their interoceptive channel, and they're able to be more accurate.
Wow. So have investment banks all been pounding on your door to say, please talk to our traders?
I don't think I'm going to work at the bank. That was a one-off. I am done with traders. So that's, yeah.
I can imagine that many groups would, have to deal with risky decision-making and may benefit, whether it's financial benefit or, in the current climate, politicians and civil servants are making a lot of these decisions.
Absolutely, they really are. So I can imagine it's something that could be widely applied. I think that's definitely true. And I'm using it to try, to help people with their anxiety. But yeah, absolutely, it could be applied in many different spheres.
And if you're aware of, the fact that you're sensitive to your gut feelings, does that sort of consciousness make you less good at it? Is it the case that by hearing this, you then tune in and therefore you stop sort of doing the intuitive aspect and maybe overthink it?
So that's what the data from the traders suggested. I think it's about whether it's an internal attribution or an external attribution. So I think if it's about how I feel, then an insight into interception may not be a bad thing. It may not interfere. But I think if you want an external attribution about whether that thing is good or that thing is bad, then it might help to not have metacognitive insight, but to be led and guided by those decisions. And that's what the trader data suggested, because the combination for them was poor insight, good accuracy, and it was an external attribution they were making.
Okay, cool. There's a really interesting question here I wanted to share. Somebody said, this might be quite basic because I don't know a lot about neuropsychology, but what's the connection between frontal lobe involvement in sort of more conscious decision-making and reasoning and the less conscious, more instinctive reasoning that you get from interception? How do they relate to one another? Hard question, but a really good one.
It's a really good one. So I think it's about the degree to which decisions have an emotional component. So if your higher order architecture is interacting and in accordance with the emotional reaction, then they're working together in tandem. You have an emotional reaction and then you have higher order neurocircuitry to navigate that. In the absence of any of these kinds of autonomic changes, and if a decision is quite neutral, then potentially it can be dissociated from these more emotional autonomic changes. But it's a great question.
We tend to think of ourselves as being very rational when we make decisions. So, you know, when you go buy a new car or something, you do all your prep and you look into the various features and prices and whatnot. But there's still a question about how much you're still influenced by things that are not rational. The smell of the car, the color of the paint, the feel of the seats, all sorts of things like that. And it seems like maybe these kind of higher order rational conscious decision makings are less independent of emotional influences than we might think.
I think that's exactly right. And you phrased it really nice, because I maybe in my last answer dichotomized too much the rational and emotional. And I think you've put it really nicely. And that we could have emotional reactions to rational things. Like if that's a good price, you can be like, great price. And that, even though that's a rational piece of information, it's instilling an emotional reaction in us that we might not realize is emotional, because we've been seeing it as rational. So I would say, yes, the two are very much intertwined, and it's very rare to have something completely neutral. But also, I guess the other thing is these autonomic changes aren't just related to emotion. They can also be related to other states, such as anticipation. So just while you're waiting for something to happen, your heart rate slows down to get in an action ready state, and then it suddenly goes, so that you also can get these autonomic changes in the absence of emotion as well. But I would agree with you that they're coupled together much more than separated.
And I think there's a lot more questions, but there's just a little bit of time left, and this one's so topical. Tobia, my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, has asked whether or not you've had a chance to look at interceptive awareness and accuracy in the current protests that are happening around the world, because obviously highly charged emotional situations and sometimes misperceptions lead to really unfortunate situations. Are you doing that? Is anybody doing that?
I don't know that anyone is, but I think it's a great question. And I think that it's also really heartening to see all the protests, even though people are scared about the virus, the strength of emotion about fighting for equality and fighting for what's right is also potentially driving these protests. So investigating it would also, in that context, would be an interesting thing.
Fantastic. Well, we're running out of time, but I would say, look, if anybody is aware that such research is happening, do let us know, because that would be a topic for another webinar that would be really fascinating. But for now, what I'd like to do is thank Professor Sarah Garfinkel for a really stimulating and interesting discussion. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you for inviting me, Joe.
It was a real pleasure. Next week, we're going to try to get to the bottom of this idea of unconscious influences on behavior, so please do join us.